Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. In our last episode, we took a look at the geography of the stretch of East African coastline that would one day be known as the Swahili Coast. Today, let's dig a bit deeper, literally, examining the prehistory of the Swahili Coast and see what archaeology can tell us about the region's earliest inhabitants and the effects of prehistoric migrations on the human landscape of this fascinating part of the world. Season 6, Episode 2, The World's Oldest Trade Route? When studying the early prehistory of humanity, there's a lot of emphasis on the migration of humans out of Africa. It's pretty well established and accepted among anthropologists, despite what some fringe people like to claim, that modern Homo sapiens can trace our earliest origins to Africa, and enormous quantities of ink have been spilled over the question of where, when, and why humanity first expanded beyond our native continent. I find it interesting, though, that there's a comparative lack of interest in how humanity spread throughout Africa. After all, as of the recording of this episode, the most widely accepted theory of Homo sapiens' origins places our origin as a migratory population of humans in the Sahara grasslands, in a range of land approximated from modern-day Morocco to the fringes of Ethiopia. Interestingly, the vast majority of humanity's earliest migrations outside of our original habitat took place not from Africa out of Africa, but rather within the continent. One of the very most impactful migrations in human history is that which resulted in the populating of the southern half of the African continent. This migration, or migrations, most likely occurred in multiple waves from around 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, populating the southern half of the continent with modern Homo sapiens. Just like in the migrations outside of Africa, there is some pretty strong genetic evidence that this early migration of modern humans into the southern half of Africa encountered other subspecies of humanity, notably Homo heidelbergensis, and that, just like in other parts of the world, there was a fairly widespread practice of interbreeding between modern humans and other closely related hominids. These early populations of hunter-gatherers intermittently spread throughout the eastern coast of Africa, including the lands that would one day become the Swahili Coast, establishing a basal population that would be further transformed by dozens of later waves of migration. The regions of coastal Tanzania and Kenya settled into a population pool likely descended from these very early prehistoric migrations throughout the Middle and even into the Late Stone Age. Since most prehistoric sites from the era are open air and exposed to the environment, there is tragically, a lot less than you would expect in terms of archaeological evidence from the region, with only occasional and partial human remains, combined with the rare cracked ostrich egg or fish skeleton to guide our understanding of the region's prehistory. As we discussed for a bit in our previous episodes on the contentious history of the Bantu expansion, archaeologists and anthropologists have historically tried to link this basal lineage of the East African coast with modern hunter-gatherer groups in the area like the Hadza, once purported to be distant linguistic relatives of the Khoikhoi and San languages of southern Africa. These days, though, that purported link is widely disregarded, and Hadza is viewed as a linguistic isolate rather than a distant Khoisan cousin. It's also not clear the extent to which the Hadza descend from that original basal lineage or from a different, smaller, later migration that could have happened between 100 and 50,000 years ago. Beyond that, there's not much in terms of concrete evidence linking the early hunter-gatherers of the Swahili Coast to the Hadza. In short, sadly, the early and middle Stone Ages of the region remain largely enigmatic, barring any future revolutionary archaeological discoveries. Meanwhile, around 10,000 years ago, pastoral nomadic people would begin to migrate into the inland regions of Kenya and Tanzania as early as 10,000 years ago, and radically transform the lifestyle of that region. However, while nomadic pastoralism was taking off in the interior of these regions, the coastal regions of East Africa would remain populated still for several thousand more years by relatively isolated hunter-gathering populations. These populations around the coast and its fringes thrived in an era labeled by anthropologists as the East African Aqualithic, or Wet Stone Age. The so-called Aqualithic lifestyle took hold during a time known as the African Humid Period, a prolonged climatological era of higher rainfall and humidity throughout the central and northern parts of the African continent. Of course, this higher humidity most famously manifested by allowing the Sahara to take the form of semi-arid grasslands, a topic we've discussed numerous times in previous shows, but other parts of the continent were affected as well. Notably, in a long inland band stretching from Sudan to the Great Lakes and then to the Swahili coast, the heightened level of rainfall and humidity led to higher water levels in rivers, streams, and lakes, as well as the formation of a long stretch of permanent wetlands. This large band of wetlands corresponds very closely to the geographic limits of the pastoral nomadic lifestyle. After all, it's hard to guide and steer cattle through a deep swamp. Instead, the Aqualithic period saw this large wetland region develop a unique prehistoric culture that was highly dependent on its unusual waterlogged environment. Understandably, Aqualithic people relied heavily on freshwater fish as the main staple of their diet, while also using bones from animal skeletons as the primary material for tool making. For example, alongside the stone tools that were typical for this time period, the Aqualithic hunter-gatherers also made harpoons, chisels, combs, arrowheads, and pottery decorations out of fish, crocodile, and even hippo bones. The reliance on bones from these semi-aquatic or aquatic species for pottery decoration as one of the most notable and unique features of the Aqualithic culture. They are incredibly specific pottery motifs. The Aqualithic culture used a mixture of clay, sand, and quartz to form their main body of their pottery, a special style of pottery known to archaeologists and paleoanthropologists as wavy line pottery. This style emerged in wetland East Africa between 10,000 and 7,000 BC. As you might guess by its name, this type of pottery was defined by the repeated motif of engraved wavy lines in its body, mimicking the appearance of cords of a woven basket. Now, of course, other types of pottery had been independently invented in many parts of the world by this point, but depending on your exact definition that you use, wavy line pottery has been claimed to be the first example in the history of humanity of a well-defined, widespread, and noticeably distinct decorative style. However, by about 3000 BC, a gradual climatic shift was beginning to change the lifestyle of the people throughout the Aqualithic range. During this period, the rainfall and humidity of Africa continued a long trend of decline, and eventually, those river levels in East Africa began to fall, and the wetlands began to dry up into coastal plains and forests. While pastoral nomads had lived alongside the Aqualithic hunter-gatherers for generations in the northern reaches of East Africa, starting around 3000 BC and likely a result of that changing climate, a growing number of hunter-gatherers in the region started to make the shift to the now more feasible in their home region pastoral farming lifestyle, driving the older lifestyle of hunting and gathering closer to extinction. Along the very close stretches of the coast, however, the shift was a notably different one, not towards pastoral farming, but instead in the direction of settled, permanent agriculture. While the mainstream belief of anthropologists for decades was that settled agriculture didn't arrive in coastal East Africa until the Bantu expansions much later, closer to the 1st century AD, a growing body of archaeological evidence has challenged this wide-held assumption, and these days it has become widely accepted that the agricultural Neolithic of East Africa began about 3,000 years earlier than previously assumed. Excavations at numerous sites along the coastline of Tanzania or along its neighboring islands, such as at the Tendaguru Formation, Mafia Island, or Zanzibar, have uncovered evidence for the spread of a new type of pottery into the region around 3000 BC. This style of pottery is less reminiscent of the wavy line style pottery associated with Aqualithic hunter-gatherers, and instead appears to be a more southern extension of Narosura pottery, a style mostly associated with the pastoric Neolithic of inland Kenya. However, while this pottery is stylistically similar to Narosura, the coastal variation of this pottery appears not to be traded from them, but rather locally sculpted. As opposed to pressed wavy lines made with bone tools, the coastal variation of Narasura pottery is decorated with a combination of pressed engravings, crotch hatching, and charcoal-drawn patterns. Alongside these new forms of pottery, there is substantial evidence for widespread, organized, and sustained agriculture. Abandoned irrigation channels, archaeobotanical remains of cultivated crops, grinding bowls featuring chemical plant remains, domesticated animal remains, and more seem to point to the idea that even as early as 3000 BC, the Neolithic Revolution was underway in coastal Kenya and Tanzania. Settlements on the coast largely took the form of small communities and villages during this period, often based around large caves that formed a type of shared community center. But in my opinion, the most interesting question surrounding these early Neolithic settlements is whether they may have been part of an early precursor to the Indian Ocean trading network. At Kumbi Cave, a Neolithic site on the island of Zanzibar, archaeologists have discovered numerous artifacts ranging from about 20,000 BC to about 180, including some of the earliest evidence for Neolithic farming in the region, such as the remains of cows, goats, and dogs. But mixed in with these old remains are something a bit more puzzling: chicken bones. Archaeological dating of charcoal dust that was found coating the chicken bones estimates that these bones might have been as old as 6,000 years. This might not seem like a huge deal at first. I mean, it's just some really old chicken bones, but, and this is huge, these inconspicuous remains of poultry might be evidence of a very early transoceanic contact between coastal Tanzania and South Asia. See, while chicken is the most widespread, globally ubiquitous form of meat on the planet today, in 4000 BC it was anything but. Chickens originated from a domesticated form of jungle fowl, a type of bird native to India and Southeast Asia, and was first domesticated, of course, in its indigenous region. Chicken rearing at the time was just starting to take its first steps outside of Southeast Asia, with the first evidence of chicken remains in southern China and Iran appearing around the same time, while the bird was still entirely unknown in Europe, most of the Middle East, and much of northern Asia. That would mean that if the age of these Kumbi chicken bones is legitimate, that these societies and Zanzibar imported the birds directly from societies in India across the ocean. This would be evidence for arguably the very first example of transcontinental maritime trade in the entirety of human history, and provide us with a much earlier starting period for the famous Indian Ocean trade system than previously assumed. Now, this sounds incredible, but I do need to cool your jets if you're getting excited about this. For any claim this monumental, some skepticism is warranted. In particular, the dating method that was used to get that 4000 BC date on these chicken bones has received some healthy criticism, as has the identification of the bone as coming from a chicken. While the bone does certainly resemble that of a domestic chicken, it could also come from a different local species known as the helmeted guinea fowl, which was and still is widely consumed in the region and does have some bones that are reminiscent of those of a domesticated chicken. So while the idea of a transoceanic trade route to Zanzibar in 4000 BC is incredible and fascinating, it might be, in my opinion, better to lean on the side of caution here and assume that this is probably the simplest solution, simply a misidentified bone from the local species of guinea fowl. Beyond the question of whether or not the people of coastal Kenya and Tanzania were involved in an early proto-form of Indian Ocean maritime trade, there are many other mysteries surrounding who exactly the late Neolithic people of Tanzania were, what language or languages they spoke, and how they relate to the region's current inhabitants. Of course, many of these questions are themselves wrapped up in many inconsistent ideas of one of the most consequential events in the history of Central and Southern Africa, the Bantu expansion. Like I already said, I did a whole mini-series on the mysterious and still widely contested history of the migration of Bantu speakers throughout the southern half of the African continent, which therefore includes, by extension, Tanzania and most of Kenya. However, while much of the timeline surrounding the Bantu expansion in the region remains unclear, what we can say with some fairly strong certainty is that by the late Neolithic period, the vast majority of the population of coastal Tanzania and Kenya were likely speakers of Southern Cushitic languages, a branch that split off from the Cushitic language family, making these languages distant relatives of modern Somali, Oromo, and other languages common throughout the Horn of Africa. We can say this with some degree of certainty due to the unusually high number of Southern Cushitic loanwords that persist in Kiswahili and other closely related Bantu languages in the area today. While the coastal varieties of these languages have been extinct for some time now, some close relatives of theirs still persist in inland Tanzania and Kenya today, such as the Iraku language, still spoken as the first language by almost 1 million people as we record this episode. However, where things become confusing is the timetable of when these Southern Cushitic people were joined by a group of new arrivals whose culture would one day surpass them as the main demographic of the region. Credible estimates for the arrival of Bantu speakers in coastal Tanzania can range pretty substantially, from anywhere between 1000 BC to as late as 600 AD, though a date somewhere between those two, usually around 0 BC AD, is more widely preferred, give or take 100 years. Now, back in our Bantu expansion episodes, we talked about the contentious question of whether the Bantu expansion took the form of local pre-Bantu cultures being assimilated and absorbed, or replaced outright, and ultimately came to the conclusion that it was a case-by-case question. Well, several genetic studies of coastal Bantu-speaking populations today in Tanzania seem to suggest that, at least in this region, the event was one of absorption, not annihilation. A substantial minority of the Kiswahili-speaking population of the region possess certain genetic markers associated with South Cushitic-speaking populations elsewhere, but absent from a large portion of the Waswahili. This seems to indicate that at least a noticeable portion of the current Waswahili population has, to one degree or another, descent from the South Cushitic speakers of the region. As we established earlier, while the arrival of Bantu speakers in the region has traditionally been viewed as synonymous with the introduction of settled agriculture into the area, this traditional view has been so thoroughly challenged to the point of it being essentially non-existent in recent literature. However, just because they didn't necessarily bring the concept of agriculture, didn't mean that the Bantu migration was without the delivery of technological innovation. While it too has recently come under some less concrete skepticism, the arrival of Bantu speakers in the region is still widely associated with the advent of the exploitation of iron. While there is some very limited evidence for the use of iron tools at sites associated with pre-Bantu populations, this evidence is far more dubious than the evidence for settled agriculture. The few and far between examples of purportedly pre-Bantu iron tools and creations may have been imported through maritime trade, or, more likely, were not actually pre-Bantu at all. What can be said for certain is that the arrival of Bantu migrants represents the dawn of a new form of advanced ironworking and localized iron mining and refinement. Iron is an incredibly valuable material in the types of tools that it can make and the labor efficiency that they provide. And, fairly soon, iron will become one of the earliest main exports from the region of the Swahili coast. Now, depending on what timetable of Bantu expansion you support, the arrival of Bantu migrants into the Swahili coast may have coincided with the true explosion of commerce and trade in the Indian Ocean. And, as the coast of East Africa and its inhabitants gained increasing notoriety among merchants around the world, the Swahili coast would begin to take on its first steps into a new identity, one that would define its history from ancient times throughout the following millennia, as one of the most fascinating examples of cosmopolitanism in the ancient and medieval world. Join us in our next episode, as we explore the very earliest ancient accounts of the region, search for long-lost ruined cities of the past, and enter into the first chapters of the Swahili coast as one of the most trafficked maritime trade hubs in human history. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayo Fagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Pascal Mokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwambodike, Kwajo Amankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Rassan Firgiani, Ni T, Kitty, Matt T, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, Ellen Fisher, Jessica, Switson Blair, and Yannick Bolnett, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, 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 really means a lot.